So thank you for coming. It's great to see a full house at a talk. There's usually about 5 people. I think there's a testament perhaps to Annie more than anything else. So I'm Helena Tobin, I'm the Artistic Director here at the Arts Centre, for those of you who don't know me. And today we're going to be talking with Annie Hogg, who is the artist in our current exhibition, which is part of our Artists in Residence, which is sponsored and supported by Tipperary County Council and Arts Office. So this talk is part of the current exhibition, Lost by Annie Hogg, which is part of the Artists in Residence scheme that we run here every year. And that is specifically for a Tipperary artist. So the artist can be from or residing in Tipperary. And the purpose of that is specifically to support Tipperary-based artists that maybe are from here, that don't have an opportunity to show here, or who want an opportunity to really progress and move their work forward. So the residency is not studio-based. We don't have a studio here in the Arts Centre for the artists to work in, but there is a fee that goes towards production. And I suppose myself and Melanie Scott, the arts officer, and one or two others would have been assessing the panel and looking at the applications and seeing, well, who can deliver in the time frame. Because the announcement and the residency is really only about 4 months, which is quite short. And that was basically due to just timelines. And it's really trying to find an artist who's ready to go. It's not a 1 year or 2 year lead-in time. So there isn't that opportunity, or there hasn't been the last couple of years, for somebody to really get into a body of work and extend it. So they already have to be kind of on the ground running. And that's something we have to take into consideration when we're looking at the applications. And I think the thing that we saw in Annie's work was exactly that, was that she had really thought through the process and thought through the work and had a clear idea about what she wanted to deliver. So she really did hit the ground running. And as we'll get into as well, it's been quite an intense period of work. And there will be positives and minuses to that. So we'll kind of look and pull that apart and look at that as well as the themes. So we're going to keep this conversational. I'm not going to pretend to be David Frost or someone, you know. So I suppose the first thing I'm interested in as well, and I think you'll be interested in, is why this work and why now? Why did you make this application? What was kind of going on in your mind and your practice around this location? And why did it particularly seem like this was the right time to go?
Hello everybody, I'm Annie. I had the idea pretty soon after the event occurred in August 2021. The notion was already there to make something like this, and then the incident of the changeover of the landscape occurred, and it seemed like a good way of using that idea that I had.
Yeah.
In work that I make anyway, I would use materials of particular places for particular reasons. So that was kind of a recurring theme. There was no way without the artist residency that I was going to be able to make a body of work this big and in this style. And that was really important, and that's why I applied for it, because I recognised that I didn't have the space to make it, I didn't have some place to put it, I didn't have the funding to make it, but it was in my head to make it, and it was burning, and I really wanted to get it out there.
Yeah.
And it was a step away. Up to this point, I stepped back into an art practice a few years ago, and I've been working just on mark making on paper, and still am doing that kind of work with the ambition of going back towards a sculptural practice, so installation like this, but it's not set up, so you kind of, you know, it's a hard juggle.
Yeah, and I suppose then, I think that leads on to the actual process itself of making the work, the actual residency and the making, because like I said a little earlier, you seem to have a clear idea about what you wanted to create, but at the same time, it's morphed and changed as these things naturally do. So what was your starting point? Where did you kind of start? Where did you go, okay, this is all a bit big, I just need to start somewhere and then see what progresses from that. So where did you start?
The hanging panels.
Okay.
That was an ambition for a good few years to make a big walk-through installation piece. And that kind of came from, I used to kind of flit around on the festival scene doing bits and bobs there, and I always had the notion that it would be great to do something really big and interactive. So that's where that kind of came from. That had been bubbling for quite a few years. And the initial application that I put in was that I'd make a video documenting a particular thing and have that shining through the panels. as you can see, what actually occurred in the here and now is a completely different kind of work. And it's kind of a culmination of a few other installation ideas I had that worked better right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, it started with the panels and then kind of moved back. Next came the maps.
Yeah.
And I only made the maps because I was just focusing on myself, looking at it. I didn't even think of the initial maps as being something to go on the walls. But thank God we did have that conversation in one of the mentoring sessions.
Yeah. And I think that the first thing I saw were the maps, were the drawings, I think were the first thing that Annie showed to me. And even though I knew the story and I knew what had happened on the site and I understood the impact of that, I found the visual description of it very powerful. And I went, that's gonna hit people right in the gut, because it just kind of, there was an impact, something that it's gone, this is gone and it's big. But when you see it kind of really laid out visually like that. And did it take you long to kind of go through that, or was that just like in kind of almost burnt into your brain where everything was?
Yeah, I know where all of those things are. Like everything that's marked there, like in those places is where I had seen them. I would have been up around that area quite an awful lot, walking dogs, generations of dogs. And it's all like that, that's all the truth as I remember it, as I remember seeing things in those places and knowing those species to be there. I started running out of room, so that's how come there's another list of species over there. But it actually worked quite well visually, so it's fine. Yeah, it's pure memory. That's pure memory.
Yeah. And it's interesting, for me it was interesting because the show we had kind of prior to Christmas with Laura Fitzgerald, we had her dad's drawing of the fields down an inch, and that was from memory, and he'd have things like so-and-so's field, the bog, the this, and there's something about that kind of human memory of a place and how we kind of use certain ways of describing it and map making that I think is much more effective in getting a message across, or kind of evoking a sense of an emotion, something like that. So after the maps, did the maps, I suppose, are a very literal illustration. Mm-hmm. Then we have the hanging installation, which I know was very difficult. I don't just mean the installation, I mean the making of them. Yeah. So maybe you could describe the process of how these marks came on this material, maybe what this material is, and kind of the effect you're trying to create, and how you kind of impacted on the material and made them as they are now.
So the material is called geotextile. It's a it's a nylon. I can never say that word. It's used in the construction industry for several functions. It's load bearing. It allows drainage functions. I think it might even a lower grade to be used in kind of gardening as well as a weed suppressant, that kind of stuff. It's something that a big roll of it had been given to me or left behind, and I asked if I could have it. So I cut it up to 4 by 4 meters, squared pieces, and began experimenting with how to apply pigment that I made into paint to the nylon. So nylon is notorious. If anybody has ever tried to dye a pair of jeans back to black, the nylon never takes the dye, and it was pretty much the same carry on here. So I stepped away from my usual paint making formats of using natural binders and all that kind of stuff, and just used PVA glue and lashed it on, basically. That's what I did for the charcoal, the first one. That's a charcoal, 2 types of charcoal, 2 grades of charcoal that I made from the same hawthorn stump. The middle one was a little bit different, but the third one is ground minerals plus some other stuff and charcoals as well. So they were all just painted on in layers. To apply the rust, which is the second one. So that was a rusty panel from a machine that I found up in the ditch of the site. I made a dye bath, essentially like a yarn dyer would do, and did what I knew to do, which was adding water and vinegar. Didn't work. Panic. It had been sitting there for 3 weeks at this stage, and it was taking in parts, but very lightly. Luckily, I'm a member of a study group around botanical and natural colour making. So I got in touch on one of our meetings with one of the ladies who had done a intensive rust dyeing masterclass workshop. There are such things. And she said, throw in peroxide. How did you do peroxide? So that made it stick, which was amazing because, yeah, the nylon is very hard to uptake any kind of colour like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was difficult. It was also difficult working with it because they are 4 meters by 4 meters squared, as I said. Some of them have been cut back a wee bit. My studio is 3 meters by 4 meters in its entirety. So I was working on a big board against the studio wall in quarters. So for the panel 1 and panel 3, I'd done lots of sketches, I'd gotten all my measurements, and then I started applying my lines to get like my shapes to all line up and my lines to line up. And I worked on each of the panels in 1 quarter, 1 quarter. So paint, let it dry out. Following day, come back, move it over, paint the next part, all of this kind of stuff. And that went on. And there was a lot of walking away and coming back and wondering an extra bit here and another layer there, all of that kind of carry on. When I brought them in for the hanging, it was the first time that I saw them in their entirety as whole pieces on the ground, which is probably really poor practice. So it was difficult working on that scale in my studio, but it was also quite a lot of fun. There was a lot of like walking under it and through it and around it, and
which is ultimately what you want the viewer to do. So
yeah, exactly. So even in its formation, that was happening. So it was like a little cavern in the studio for a few months. So it was great.
Yeah. And then the charcoal on this, all of the charcoal on this is from the stump, which we see at the back of the gallery space, which is our kind of vessel for the sound.
Yes.
And one of the things I know that maybe wasn't necessarily at the outset going to be such a major role, but it seems that like to get the work together and to have the real expertise involved meant that you had to work with an awful lot of people. Mm-hmm. So maybe, I suppose, the pieces particularly where there's others involved is the sound piece, which maybe we'll talk about next, and then the beautiful glass installation at the back with the bronze twigs. Yeah. So how did the sound come about and working with Natalia? How did that come around?
So I say halfway through, I was kind of aware that it was going to be a large enough installation, and there wasn't, there was a certain amount of funding from the residency, and that went so far. And then, bless them, I luckily got the Agility Award from the Arts Council, which meant I had the funding to have the bronze made and have the music the music piece made. So I contacted Natalia Baylis. She's a sound maker and composer up in Leitrim. She's also a good friend of mine. So I knew her work. I knew that how she worked, and that we'd have a conversation and that she'd deliver, and she did. So Natalia came down. We just had a chat around everything, went for a walk, and I left her off to her own devices, and it was easy peasy because I know her work and because I know how she works, that it would land when it was meant to land on the desktop.
Yeah, so you were able to kind of trust her and kind of leave it to her. You weren't like going micromanaging and going, what's it sound like?
Not at all. Yeah. And every so often I get a text message saying, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And each time it was like, whatever you do is fine. I'm happy with what you do. You get it. And she would have a similar environmental understanding as what I would have, and similar background and all. So it was all the easiest process ever.
And then we'll go on to the glass and the bronze.
Which
wasn't so easy. So I suppose the first, I remember when we were talking about it first, and you had a clear idea about wanting to capture some of the debris that was on the site that was kind of burned when the site was cleared, and put certain things into these vessels and kind of showcase those. And there was the idea of twigs, and then, could we make the twigs into bronze? And God, will they be able to cast that? But again, you found the right people for the job. Yeah. So tell us about how that all transpired.
So for the residency, it's a very short period of time. I found out in September that I had it, and we started devising by, would have been, I'd say, mid-October. Everything had changed, not everything, a lot had changed. And I wanted to use the idea of the glass. I'm not a glass worker. I know absolutely nothing about glass, and I didn't know there was so much involved in glass until I went investigating it. So I knew that I wanted hand-blown pieces. I knew that I had to get larger things into them for the shapes that I wanted, and all of this kind of stuff. So I started telephoning people. There's a directory of glass workers Ireland. It's amazing. And it being October, everyone's up the walls because they're all getting ready for the Christmas market. Not a hope in hell. Not only that, the glass blowing that I wanted was apparently a little bit more complicated than in my ignorance of glass than I understood. So the very first person I got in touch with Adrian Diamond up in Leitrim again. She had just moved back from Scotland, didn't have her own studio set up, and she said, look, if you're really stuck, get back to me. So I got back to her.
Please help.
Oh, jeepers. She was really good. She was literally just moved into a cottage up in Leitrim someplace. There's nothing there. There is no studio. And so she was getting the gas guys to come in and check about getting connections in. And she really went above and beyond. And all the time I'm at the end of the phone kind of going, what do you mean it's not going to happen? Oh God. And she kept saying, it'll happen. I'll get there. Don't worry. And because I didn't know the woman, I've never met this woman in person. We've only had very long and lovely conversations by phone about the making. But got there eventually. It wound up that she went over up to some part north in Antrim to another man's studio to work the glass for me. So she made it, came back, posted it down, and all was well. But there was a few touch and go moments, quite a lot of panic. And there were certain times where I came in a probably brought on by too much caffeine, in a bit of a kerfuffle to Helena going, the glass isn't going to work, I'm just going to have to do something totally different.
Yeah, we had a counselling session in the office one Saturday. But then, so obviously the hand blown glass didn't transpire, didn't work. So how did you get around that? What did you find? What solution did you find?
Oh, she did hand blow it.
So she hand blew
all of those pieces, yeah. Someplace up north. And then came back down again. It worked out a lot more expensive because I wasn't just paying for the hand blowing, then I had to pay for the transport and the studio rental and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And then obviously to get hard objects, solid objects into these kind of beaker-like, not beaker-like, but these are kind of, these vessels.
So I supplied Adrian, the glass worker, with working drawings that were really specific internal measurements for the objects. So I made several of the little bramble vessels, the umbles. I had collected loads of them and jarred a load of them. So they were kind of a little bit mutable in their measurement. The skull, however, wasn't. The skull has a measurement and that's it. And I wasn't going filing back. I wasn't going breaking pieces off or anything. But she somehow managed to work the internal measurements exactly to the working drawings that I gave her. And then that also had to include the diameter of the top part. And that was before we even got to the drilling, because then the drilling had to be done, and that turned out to be really difficult. And apparently people don't drill glass anymore. It's an old-fashioned route. Through all of that initial process, trying to find a glass worker related in Dublin and said I could help out with certain parts of it. So we went to Dublin with all the glass and the bronze, and everything was matched up. And she drilled for me. And I spent the morning in a cafe fretting because she told me to leave the studio, that she couldn't handle me looking over her shoulder.
I can't handle your energy.
Again, too much coffee.
So basically there was hand-blown glass made in Leitrim.
Antrim.
Made in Antrim. She'd go to studio.
Yeah.
So made in Antrim by a woman who lived in Leitrim from Scotland. Going international here nearly. And then it had to be drilled. But then it also had to be cut in order to put the solid objects into them. Yeah.
So it came cut. Whatever way it was blown, she was able to cut it.
Okay.
When it was still hot, I guess. I don't really know. Scrap that part. I don't know how she cut it. She did.
You're like, okay, it's cut.
It works.
And so then it had to be
glued.
Then
it had to be glued. Yeah. So Neil Hickey over in Clonmel Glass and Mirrors, I went into him about the drilling. And he was so kind. He said, look, I can do the UV gluing for you. And I have this drill that's this size, but the drill bit sizes weren't what I required. So I went back into him one day with my box of glass bits and bobs, all of the charred pieces. And the charred pieces are really, really delicate. You don't grab them, they're extremely delicate. So when I went to that poor man, kind of going, just very carefully. And he just did it, just easy peasy, just like that. It was wonderful.
Yeah. And how did you find that whole thing of having to, because there's so many different types of art practice, but say for instance now, there are certain practices that, say you're sculpting and you're carving stone, or you're painting and you're painting, whether it's paper or canvas or whatever. You're making the work. You have full control over it. Whereas in this instance, you had to get so much expertise involved. You kind of had to hand over some of your ideas and your babies, so to speak. And did you find that difficult? Interesting?
I'm a control freak. I just am. And that was part of the problem with the glass, was that I didn't have control of the situation and wasn't able to give trust to the situation or the glassworking because I didn't know her. I just didn't know. And I really struggled with it. There was a potential for the bronze to go that way as well, but when I went down to the foundry in Carrigaline, Mick Wilson's foundry, and we were chatting away and I'd said, oh yeah, you know, God, it's lovely to smell a foundry again. I did my diploma in the Crawford and I did a lot of bronze casting within that. And I said that to him and he was like, sure. So like, no, it'll keep down costs if you want to come down every day and do the work yourself, and then I'll just keep an eye on things. So firstly, I was delighted because I had control. Secondly, I was delighted I really wanted to get my hands back into that process. I really missed the bronze process. And I don't know if there was a thirdly there, so I'll just stop.
They're two good enough reasons, don't you?
So that was great. That was, there was a point of contact always with it, and I worked with him. Now, I mean, if a part of it wouldn't have happened without the man. Do you know?
Yeah, of course. Again,
like I did it all.
Again, you needed that expertise nearby so you could run things by them and kind of go, am I going the right way here, or is this going to not actually work in the material and work again? So there's a fake wall on that wall which has loads of extra supports behind it because all the walls in here are like, you know, we're trying to find a stud down there. We found one. We're like, there should be more than one. But anyway, we managed to... And poor Annie, it was like the install, and we had everything set up, ready to go, up on the wall, big job. And then it was like putting the glass on. I've never seen someone so nervous. She was just so nervous the glass was going to fall or break or something. But I think it was, I don't know, personally, I just thought it was, you really, really pushed yourself. You pushed all the materials, you pushed everyone working with the materials to try and do something maybe they hadn't done before, aka drilling glass, or making very, very, very thin kind of casts. Yeah,
which is bronze casting was touch and go because they're so small pieces, and because of the process and the materials that he uses in the foundry. So even at that point of making the molds and pouring the wax in, and then that wax comes out, and then we're in the molten bronze. And at that point, it was really like this. The bronze just might not travel to where it needs to travel because of the size of them. Yeah.
And one of the things people have said to me as well during the course of the show, and it's something I kind of felt the minute it was installed, was that for a description of an action that is very unsubtle, you know, it's not, what happened on the site is not subtle, but how you managed to express what happened very clearly using the materials is very subtle. It's kind of poetic. There's a kind of, there's a poetry to it. It's not literal in so many ways, but then in other ways it is. And were you very clearly trying to, when you were thinking about the work, was that kind of variety of materials and that sensitivity of materials really core from the beginning, that you didn't want to be hitting people over the head with something, so to speak?
Yeah, 100%. And I think there's a fine balance in the way that I work anyway, but specifically in this piece, that the use of the materials is really important because the materials themselves have a story, and I take raw materials and grind them down to make paint, or I take a natural thing and char it as a sculptural object. It's that kind of, always that, and there's always a story of where it comes from and what it means and all this carry on. But it needs to also be able to stand alone as a visual object, as an aesthetic, without any knowledge of the materiality behind it. So it kind of, there's a flux to get that right.
Yeah, but there's always those two considerations kind of playing off each other.
Always
in the practice.
Yeah.
So I'm going to open it up to the floor because I think there might be a lot of questions for Annie.